if you can never understand where somebody else is coming from, then there's no point in discourse. There's no point in speaking with other people or of reading or of learning. We are in solitude,
that's a Hobbesian state. That's a state of war.
Absolutely.
When conversation ceases, war emerges.
Exactly.
And if we can't understand each other, there's no recourse except for force.
And this is why it worries me so much when I hear this done particularly by identity politics people in relation to race, and particularly obviously to do with it if you happen to be black, is if people say you can never understand my experience. I think, but if a person who is not black can never understand a person who is, then we're in for a hell of a lot of trouble. Like, step back from that. We have to work hard at trying to understand each other, including each other's historic pain, including each other's current situations. But we have to keep open the possibility that we can and will try to understand each other and to speak across these alleged vast divides, which I don't think are remotely as big a divide, if they are a divide, as the various, as I say, people who believe this ethos of our time claim. But this is the one that worries me most, and it's profoundly anti-human apart from anything else. Because if you say, sign up, be a part of one of these groups, and then you've got this sort of, as I say, party manifesto set out, it completely ignores what most of us find to be our experience, I think, if we're honest as human beings, which is that we like to be able to absorb, we like to be able to understand, we like stories. We like to hear about people who are not like us. From the very beginning, we read stories about people who have no connection with our current. Why did children across the world read about princesses and princes and all sorts of other people who are nothing like in the state they are? Because we like to hear other people's stories. It's not just that they're archetypes. We want to find out about other people. We don't just want the experience that we happen to have been or been born into.
That's because that broadens our identities.
Yes.
It gives us more tools to use in the world, and we're obviously very good at that. And it is a matter of throwing your hands up in despair if you say that that's impossible. It's difficult. I mean, we're each a solitude in some sense for multiple reasons, for maybe multiple intersectional reasons for that matter.
Yes. But
that doesn't mean that communication is impossible or that it should be foregone unless you want the alternative. And the alternative is conflict. Combat.
Yes. Yes.
If I can't understand you, you're nothing like me. And there's no way that we can negotiate any peaceful way to occupy the same space.
That's right.
And so maybe that's the catastrophe you're after, but it's not an optimal outcome.
No. And it's one of the reasons why my ears have been particularly pricked in recent years by a certain retributive, rebarbative, deliberately callous discussion of certain groups of people, certain types of voters, and much more. A gleeful, willful desire not to even bother to try to understand their pain, which is, of course, as far as I can see it, nothing more than an expression of assumed, generally, vengeance.
Well, that brings us to another. Okay, so let's dive into that a bit. Obviously, at least to some degree, you're referring to what happened in the United States with regards to Trump voters, and that's basically half the population. Yeah. Well, let's start there because that's a good rat's nest to try to investigate. So, what I see and have seen happening in the West, but particularly in the United States in recent years, is the beginnings of something that resembles an out-of-control positive feedback loop. And a positive feedback loop, you know this, but I'll just outline it quickly. A positive feedback loop occurs when the inputs of a system and the outputs are the same. And so you hear this when you hear feedback at a rock concert, when a microphone gets too close to a speaker, because the microphone picks up the speaker noise and then transmits it to the speaker and then runs it through the microphone, amplifying it each time until the whole system goes out of control, essentially. And a lot of forms of psychopathology are positive feedback loops, like depression, when you get depressed, your mood goes down, and then you start to isolate yourself and get estranged from the people that you love and your friends, and that makes you more depressed, and that makes you more estranged, and then you start not going to work, and that alienates you and makes your depression worse, and you spin downwards. And positive feedback loops can erupt in societies too, and you get that in societies that are in permanent feuds, which is part of the reason that the state has to exercise a monopoly on violence. It's to stop vengeful retribution from spiraling out of control. It's a real danger. And what I see happening right now is that the right and the left are engaged in a process of positive feedback where one hits the other and the other hits back slightly harder. And then, well, I don't have to belabor the point. And I think that if you're temperamentally inclined to be on the right, you point to the left and you say, well, they started it. And if you're temperamentally inclined to be on the left, you point to the right and say, well, they started it. And and here's how they're contributing to it. And you can point to innumerable examples. And where it all started is a rather arbitrary choice on your part. The question for me is how to dampen it down. And conservatives have a real problem at the moment, I believe, because of what happened with Trump in recent weeks. And so let me tell you what I understand, and you tell me what you think, okay?
Security is top of mind for many Americans during these crazy times. Security for our country, security for our leaders, and security for our families. But you're not financially secure if all your eggs are in one basket. Gold and silver are an excellent way to diversify your savings. They're a hedge against inflation, a physical asset that is in high demand globally. Through my friends at Birch Gold Group, you can own physical gold and silver in a tax-sheltered retirement account. That's right, you can diversify an old IRA or 401k for no money out of pocket into an IRA in gold and silver. This is just one thing you can do today to secure your family's savings. Text Jordan to 989898 and receive a free, no-obligation info kit to learn the role that precious metals play in your overall savings strategy. Again, text Jordan to 989898. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of happy customers, you can trust Birch Gold to help diversify your savings and secure your family's financial future. Text Jordan to 989898 today.
I regarded Trump as a reaction to Clinton, essentially, and to her playing identity politics. And I believe that Trump didn't win so much as Hillary lost. And she lost because a sizable proportion of her base, the working class white males, basically, who were traditionally Democrat, when push came to shove, choosing between her and Trump, chose Trump, mostly as an up yours to the Democrats. And so I don't see Trump's a symptom, although he's also a causal agent. Now, unfortunately, what's occurred in the last couple of weeks has made things unbelievably complicated, because it does look like Trump went down the rabbit hole of the stolen election narrative and has caused a substantial amount of grief and misery as a consequence of that. And so I'd like your opinion about all that, and then we can discuss what might be done about that from the conservative perspective, or indeed, period.
Yes. I broadly speaking, agree with what you just said. I was in the States for a month and a bit more before the election, traveling around covering it. And I hadn't been to the US for a couple of years, as it happened. I travel a lot, as you know, in normal times. But I hadn't been to the US for a couple of years. And I was horrified by the fact that just normal discourse seemed to be impossible across political divides. All dinner tables erupted in exactly the fashion that you would expect. Everyone's stuck in their own positive feedback loops. But you did this first, but your side did that. And as you say, you could start from anywhere, but that was the nature of it. Well, there was something else, by the way, which was, my fairest estimation of the critique that the left has of the right is that they hate the right for allowing Trump to happen. And that isn't such a bad reason to dislike the right at the moment. How did you allow this man out? How did you allow him to win? That seemed to be their criticism, and there is a criticism to make of the American right over that. I think it could have been a hell of a lot worse, but it's a reasonable criticism for the right to contend with. The problem is,
well, the right has to contend with the potential power of a kind of mindless populism, just as the left has to contend with the constant potential to be swamped by intellectual like ideology. And
yes.
So if the left tends to go out of control in an intellectual direction, an ideological intellectual direction, and a lot of that is explicit in the identity politics ideology that's paramount now, and maybe it was explicit in the form of Marxism earlier, the right can easily respond to that with a pronounced implicit anti-intellectualism.
Sure.
And I think that's exactly what Trump represented. I mean, it's funny because he was a kind of elite. Obviously, he comes from a wealthy background, but he wasn't markedly part of the insider intellectual elite. And he was able to express the frustration of the common person, so to speak, with the idiocy of the intellectuals. In the manner that he acted, essentially, and in whom he had contempt for, I suppose. And you could blame that on the stupidity of the people who voted for Trump, but you could equally point to the red flag that was being waved in front of their face by the identity politics types. And again, that's another place where a positive feedback loop can easily become instantiated. The issue is how to dampen this down.
One of the other things I noticed was that, of course, on the right, there was a certain type of voter on the right in America who didn't just make peace with Trump, which was something that you could do. I wrote about this a number of times. You could say, well, these are the things he did which are reasonable, or, we're in power, so we should try to make sure that we exercise it well and have whatever impact we can to improve the administration. There was something else going on, which was people recognizing that Trump hurt their opponents, that he was a low tool to get back at the left. Now, I've heard that everywhere over recent years. That they've
definitely. There was an element of vengefulness.
Exactly.
It was up yours.
So the left have kept producing people who've been provoking us and prodding us. And we on the right in America keep producing sort of, third presses of the Bush family or various other dynastic politics that corrupts America. We keep producing them that, and we're just not giving anyone of equal vengefulness, lowness, a willingness to just hit people nastily if they come. Trump was willing to do a lot of that stuff, if not all of it. And a certain type of right-wing voter had had enough and was willing to get the only person willing to play the left on equal terms. And one other thing from that, of course, he did something that, again, the right has historically sort of not been very good at, which is having a program of his own, not just fighting the next battle you're going to lose. If people tend to think of the battleground of politics as being sort of level, and it isn't. At times it tilts more one way than the other. At times, historically, it's harder to advocate left-wing proposals on certain things, and then it suddenly becomes all downhill. It becomes easy to do it. It's in the same way, the right tends to be at a disadvantage, constantly having to push uphill, and inevitably what it does is it makes a compromise with the latest left-wing demand, and therefore the left actually accumulates a bit more power, a bit more influence, a bit more furtherance of its ideology. And that slightly sloped situation had existed in American politics in the views of a lot of people on the right for some years. Donald Trump comes along and seems to do that to it. He seems to be willing to say, no, we're not just going to be on the back foot fighting the next thing the left's going to win. We're actually going to do stuff of our own. And that is a dynamic that had been missing in American politics. And I think to that extent, a certain type of right-wing voter was willing not just to make peace with Trump, but actually willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, and indeed to allow him to use the tools of government.